Shakespeare, writing Romeo and Juliet in the very late 1500s, wrote the following. Juliet says, "O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father and refuse thy name, or if thou wilt not, be but sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet. 'Tis but thy name that is my enemy. Thou art thyself, though not a Montague." What's Montague? It is nor hand, nor foot, nor arm, nor face. Oh, be some other name belonging to a man. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other word would smell as sweet. So Romeo would, were he not Romeo called, retain that dear perfection which he owes without that title. Romeo, doff thy name, and for thy name, which is no part of thee, take all myself. Names can be beautiful, fun, fitting. Some people really like their names and find them to describe them well. In my experience as a parent, choosing a name for a soon-to-be-born little one was exciting and hopeful. It was really important to us that the names we chose not only sounded nice with a slightly challenging last name, but also that they have positive and honorable meanings. Names can also be problematic, challenging, confusing. Names can feel like a mismatch between who someone was and who someone is now. Names can trigger memories of people and places and incidents. When we were expecting one of our children, we shared the name we had chosen with an extended family member who told us that they didn't care for it because they had a negative experience of someone with that name from their childhood. That was when we learned not to share the names that we were thinking about naming our children with anyone, and not to ask expecting parents what names they have chosen until they determine what they want to share. Names can be common, familiar. There are certainly names we can think of that are the most popular each year or each decade, and we can think of many people who have those names. And then there are names that are a little more unique, with far fewer people using them. The name Naomi leans on the more unique side. As a child, I did not like my name at all. The very, very few people I knew or had heard about with that name were little old ladies, not an age group I felt particularly connected to as a child. I was envious of my friends who had more popular names like Michelle and Jenny and Kim. When I took French class in middle school, we were allowed to choose our French name. I scoured the list of suggestions and immediately knew I would be Nicole. I have learned to appreciate my name, though, over time. And now I'm excited when I meet another person with the name, which, interestingly, usually happens to be younger girls, which I guess means now I'm the little old lady. But one of the reasons I began to appreciate my name more was when I learned what it meant. The Hebrew name Naomi means sweet and pleasant, words that tend to be associated with positive feelings, a good-natured attitude, kindness, gentleness, sweet and pleasant. Perhaps we can see then why Naomi in this scripture recoils when the community of women recognized her and identify her by that name. This name is not a match for her circumstances. Sweet and pleasant? Hardly. Humans have the ability to experience 5 different types of taste. Can you name them? A little audience participation. Sweet, bitter, salty, sour. Oh. I think I might have heard someone say it. The last one is umami, or savory, meaty. It's a Japanese word. Yeah. You can look that up when you go home. Depending on what website you look up, it might say 4, it might say 7, but the one I landed on was 5 types of tastes. And I'm not even going to pretend that I understand how the sense of taste works, but it's pretty amazing how our brains receive information about the flavor of a thing via teeny tiny sensors on our tongue. And we don't even all interpret that information in the same way. This kale was a really good example. Several people raised their hand that it tasted good. Others raised their hand that it did not taste so good. Yummy, yucky. Cilantro is another example. For most people, like me, it is a pleasant, fresh green herb that enhances the flavor of things like tacos, guacamole, rice and beans, curries, or other dishes. But for somewhere between 4 and 20% of the population, people like my spouse, cilantro tastes horrible. And it ruins many an otherwise tasty dish in the process. Some say it tastes like soap. Anyone here that has that experience? I see a few. That looks like about 4 to 20% of the population. Good, good. Always like it when my statistics are proven correct. I suspect, even for those of us who like cilantro, and whether you say you liked the flavor of kale or not is kind of irrelevant, but the kale tasted bitter. Even if you don't care for that or do care for that flavor, I think it's a really good example of bitterness. And I invite you to reach back into your memory from a few minutes ago when you had that pointy, bitter leaf in your mouth and chomped it between your teeth. And remember what that bitterness tasted like. For me, anyway, it felt literally sharp on my tongue and also tasted sharp and pungent. There are some other things that come to mind when I think of bitter flavor. Unsweetened chocolate. I can think of a child I know, not one of mine, who took a spoonful of the baking chocolate. Not recommended. Strongly brewed tea or coffee, but I don't drink coffee, so I know tea better, that has not yet had a sweetener added. That bitterness, it almost sometimes makes your tongue feel fuzzy. Maybe it's just me. When we correlate that taste of bitterness to emotions, we often think of bitter feelings as maybe anger that's been residing, or sadness, or pain, or disappointment, particularly unresolved. It tends to lead to resentment over time. And so it is for Naomi, who recognizes this bitterness in herself. It occurred to me on Tuesday of this week that the text I chose to preach on Father's Day, contains the death of pretty much all the men within the first 5 verses. And I want to assure you that that was truly not intentional, and I'm not attempting to send any passive messages. Please also pay no attention to the fact that my father and husband are both not in attendance this morning. They are at camp. But these deaths, very quickly in the narrative, although much longer in actual chronological time as the story is told, reveal the significant, life-altering loss that Naomi experiences. Interpreters often identify that this story has some strong similarities to Job. We read that Naomi's husband, faced with the prospect of a famine in the land, which is never a good omen in Scripture, scooped up the family and shuttled them off to an unfamiliar place. Once settled, her husband died. After about 10 years, her 2 sons died also, leaving her alone without all the things that a male provided: security, income, honor. So after these deaths, she departs along with daughters Orpah and Ruth and heads back to where she had come from. Orpah ultimately does not accompany them, but Ruth stays committed to Naomi, and they travel together back to arrive in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Upon their return, the women of the town see Naomi and ask, "Is this Naomi? Is this sweet and pleasant, returning to town?" And she responds, "No, I am no longer Naomi, sweet and pleasant. Call me Mara, bitterness, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? I asked you to taste that kale earlier. Well, Paula technically did, followed by the sugar. Hopefully, tasting those items in that order was better than if we had asked you to do it the other way around. The bitterness was overpowered by the sweet. But perhaps, sometimes, the kale gets a little stuck in your teeth. Perhaps that bitter taste still pops back onto your tongue every now and then. Or perhaps just the memory of that bitter flavor is enough to remind you of the experience. What has been your bitterness? Your lowest low? Have you had a Job-like or Naomi-like experience with loss or pain? Perhaps you are living it right now. Perhaps it is in the past, something that is generally over and done but still lingers a bit or a lot. Perhaps there is not a specific low that you can point to, but rather a trajectory of challenge in a particular part of life or in a particular relationship with a particular person, or something that you have been working to discern for a very long time, and that discernment feels endless and not resolved. Our faith has largely grown to be one that recognizes God in the goodness and positive aspects of life, the sweetness. But I think we have become very uncomfortable with recognizing God in the loss and the suffering of life. We sing songs of joy and hope, but rarely sing songs of lament and mourning. We think about this when we plan worship. It is really difficult. We try not to end a worship service on a down note. We are told not to go to bed angry. Fictional accounts in books and movies generally respond and resolve with happy endings. We are uncomfortable being uncomfortable. Pastor, author, and former Bethany Seminary president Eugene Roop writes in his commentary book on Ruth, "Our biblical ancestors of faith took the divine promise of love and care so seriously that they would cry out to God when they experienced divine neglect. They found that God was not only big enough to handle their anger, but that God would often respond to their complaint with the love and care they had come to expect." So I wonder, do we allow ourselves to let God know when we are angry, when we are disappointed, when we feel bitter, when we feel like the world has been turned upside down on us? What if we sometimes feel angry at God, disappointed by God? How might God respond? I invite you to sit for a moment in the presence of God, surrounded by those of us who seek to follow Jesus together. I invite you to find a comfortable posture. Close your eyes if that is comfortable for you. Wiggle your toes and feel the floor under your feet. Relax your hands. Relax your shoulders. Relax your neck, your back, your knees. I invite you to sit for a moment with lament. What pain or hardship has cut you or someone you love to the bitter core of being? What seemingly endless onslaught of loss or challenge has felt insurmountable, all-encompassing, taking over identity? I invite you now to sit for a moment with gratitude. What sweetness has been experienced in the midst of that bitterness? I invite you to sit for a moment with yourself. Sit with the tension of challenge and bitterness alongside sweetness and joy. Look at yourself as if in a mirror. What name do you think you should be called or not called? What name would you be called if you had the power to name yourself? And finally, I invite you to sit for a moment with God. How does God see you, do you think? What name would God give you? The book of Ruth resolves, but the story of Naomi maybe not so much. We are left at the end of chapter 4 with Naomi silently nursing baby Obed, born to Ruth and Boaz. Obed, who, interestingly, we read was named by the same group of townswomen, unnamed townswomen, who recognized her as Naomi even when she felt like Mara. Women who recognized one aspect of her when she felt like a completely different characterization was more appropriate for her circumstances. Perhaps these townswomen recognized the potential or the hoped-for future in her, even when she could not recognize it for herself. This group of townswomen is the group who names Obed, meaning servant of God, who will go on to be the father of Jesse, who will be the father of David. Important characters in the continuing story of God's work in the world through human leaders, and for us as Christians, later connected to the genealogy of Jesus. But for Naomi, who wouldn't really know any of that, it is simply a gift to have this new life in her arms. Perhaps through and within the bitterness, she does not yet, cannot yet fully recognize the sweetness of Ruth's steadfast companionship, the sweetness of what will come through this baby Obed. But Naomi does recognize the power of God at work in the world, in both the pain and the joy, in the bitterness and the sweetness. May it be so for us as well.